It was the morning of March 6, 1944. Over the grey fields east of Berlin, contrails twisted into long silver ropes against a pale winter sky. To the men of the Luftwaffe climbing through the haze, it felt like the same battle they had fought 100 times before. Another mass of American bombers crawling toward the Reich capital, another chance to defend what remained of their sky. But something about this day was different. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At first, they couldn't name it. The formations of B-17s and B-24s appeared as usual black dots at 20,000 feet, glinting in the sun. Radio chatter filled the headphones with the routine of interception. Altitude calls, vector corrections, warnings about the incoming escorts. Most pilots dismissed those warnings the same way they had for months. They believed the escorts would turn back before Berlin, as they always had. Single-engine fighters couldn't possibly follow bombers that far from England, not with enough fuel left to fight. That assumption, long treated as fact, was about to collapse. By midday, the bomber stream stretched nearly 200 miles across central Germany. At Wittenberg, Major Wilhelm Steinmann, a veteran of more than 100 sorties, tightened his oxygen mask and adjusted the throttle of his Messerschmitt Bf 109J6. He heard the first urgent voice over the radio, a squadron from the north reporting fighters at their altitude. P-51s, the pilot shouted. Still with the bombers. Steinmann frowned. That couldn't be right. The bombers were already within sight of the Brandenburg Lakes, far beyond the known range of any American escort. When he finally spotted them himself, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. The enemy fighters were unmistakable. Silver, fuselage, bubble canopies catching the light, each bearing the long-legged silhouette of the P-51 Mustang. They were flying fast and level, weaving just above the bomber boxes, not struggling, not conserving fuel, just waiting. That was the moment many Luftwaffe pilots later described as the first time they truly realized the air war had changed. For years, the Reich's defense of its own airspace had been built on one simple equation. Heavy bombers could not survive deep in Germany without fighter protection, and single-engine fighters lacked the range to provide that protection. The equation had shaped every German air doctrine since 1942. It was what allowed them to believe that, no matter how many bombers the Americans built, daylight raids over Berlin would remain unsustainable. Now, on that cold March day, the equation no longer worked. To understand how profound that realization was, one must see it from the German perspective. The Luftwaffe of early 1944 was still formidable in experience but exhausted in resources. Aviation fuel was rationed by the litre. Aluminum production had begun to lag. Pilot training programs were shortened from 9 months to barely 12 weeks, producing airmen who could fly but not fight with the precision of their predecessors. The Reich's once dominant air arm had become a force stretched between competing illusions, one of technical superiority and one of strategic denial. Propaganda broadcasts assured the German public that American air power was a blunt, wasteful instrument, powerful but inefficient. In Luftwaffe briefings, officers repeated the claim that the Allies' single-engine fighters could not cross the Rhine and still return home. The mathematics of fuel consumption seemed to prove it, and indeed, for most of 1943, it had been true. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning had limited reach. Even with auxiliary tanks, their safe combat radius barely extended into Western Germany. Luftwaffe pilots had learned to wait near the limits of those fighters' endurance, striking the bombers once their escorts turned back toward the Channel. They called this moment the window. Within that window, over central Germany, the air was theirs again. But by the winter of 1944, rumours began spreading among pilots that the Americans had found a way to close that window. At first, it seemed like an exaggeration, another piece of frontline gossip. Reports from radar stations showed strange patterns. fighters appearing over Hanover and Magdeburg, where no fighters should be. In January, German controllers logged several instances of P-51s engaging interceptors near Leipzig and Halle, well beyond the supposed range of English bases. Commanders dismissed these sightings as mistaken identity. Then came March 4th. That day, for the first time in the war, American bombers struck Berlin in daylight, escorted by the new P-51 Mustangs of the 4th Fighter Group. Although poor weather and coordination limited the attack's effectiveness, the mission itself defied everything Luftwaffe intelligence believed possible. Many German pilots returned that day in stunned disbelief. They had fought P-51s not only near the capital but on the long route home as well. 2 days later, when more than 600 bombers returned under the same escort, disbelief gave way to dread. The Reich's last reliable assumption that distance itself could defend Berlin was gone. Back at the Luftwaffe's primary test and evaluation center at Rechlin in Mecklenburg, the realization turned into a technical puzzle. Engineers and officers gathered around the wreckage of a downed Mustang, studying every rivet and tank, searching for the secret that had extended its reach so far. The aircraft had been recovered almost intact from a field near Brandenburg. Its pilot, a young lieutenant from England, had perished in the crash. But his flight maps told the story. A round trip from Debden, England, to Berlin and back more than 1,100 miles. The numbers did not add up. German engineers knew the Mustang's internal fuel capacity, 2 wing tanks and 1 fuselage tank, amounting to roughly 269 gallons. Even with the efficient Packard-built Merlin engine, the range should have been barely enough for the journey, leaving no margin for combat. Yet eyewitnesses described the American fighters engaging Luftwaffe interceptors over Berlin for nearly 20 minutes before returning home. Something was missing from the equation. When technicians at Rechlin examined the Mustang's wing structure, they noticed fittings and fuel line connections that hinted at external tanks. Drop tanks were familiar technology. The Luftwaffe had used them since the Battle of Britain. But the question was scale and production. How large were these American tanks, and how could the Allies manufacture enough of them to outfit every escort fighter on such missions? Within days, search teams were dispatched across the countryside to recover debris from the March air battles. They found fragments of strange, silver-painted cylinders, light, flexible, and dented from impact. When intact examples arrived at Rechlin, the engineers realized why they had seemed so alien. The tanks were not made of metal at all. They were pressed from a paper-based composite material, coated in a thin layer of aluminum paint. They were cheap, disposable, and could be produced in the tens of thousands without consuming precious metal resources. For the Luftwaffe's engineers, it was a revelation both brilliant and terrifying. The Americans had solved not just the range problem, but the logistics of solving problems. Their factories could turn out more auxiliary tanks in a week than Germany could manufacture aircraft in a month. That discovery marked the beginning of a psychological collapse within the German fighter force that would unfold over the months ahead. The men who once believed in their technical superiority began to understand that the war in the air was no longer about individual skill. It was about reach, numbers, and the industrial power to sustain both. To fly a mission to Berlin and back, still ready to fight, was not simply an achievement of engineering. It was a demonstration of a nation's capacity to wage war on a scale the Luftwaffe could no longer match. By late spring, as the skies over Germany grew thick with contrails and the thunder of Merlin engines, Luftwaffe pilots would look up and know that the horizon no longer offered safety. The enemy could follow them anywhere now, even home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By the early summer of 1944, the nightmare had a shape, a sound, and a name. To every German pilot who climbed into the thin air east of the Rhine, it was the steady growl of Merlin engines high above those sleek, unbroken chains of silver that marked the arrival of the P-51 Mustangs. At first, their presence seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Luftwaffe Interceptor, once the hunters of the sky, now felt like prey before they had even sighted a bomber. Veteran Ace began to describe a strange tension before every scramble, a weight in the gut, that no amount of experience could steady. Every time we took off, one recalled years later, we already knew they would be there waiting at altitude, invisible, until they wanted to be seen. That sense of inevitability was new. For most of the war, Luftwaffe doctrine had relied on initiative striking first, dictating the encounter, breaking away before the enemy could organize a response. But the P-51's range and performance erased that advantage entirely. Wherever German fighters appeared, the Mustangs appeared too. When they climbed to attack the bombers, the Mustangs dove. When they tried to disengage, the Mustangs followed. Even refueling bays hundreds of kilometers behind the front were no longer safe. The Americans called it continuous escort. The Germans called it permanent shadow. On April 29, 1944, an event near Oschersleben turned that shadow into terror. A formation of Focke-Wulf 190A8s took off to intercept bombers heading toward Magdeburg. Their commander, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Weber, had flown nearly 200 missions since 1941. He knew the P-51s would be overhead, but believed his men could dive through the bomber formation before the escorts reacted. It was a gamble the Luftwaffe had taken many times before. They never made it to the bombers. As the German fighters climbed through 10,000 feet, they were hit by a swarm of Mustangs descending from the sun. The first pass tore through the formation like a blade through silk. 6 aircraft went down in less than 30 seconds. The rest scattered, pursued individually. Weber's radio filled with calls for help, then static. He was one of only 2 to return to base. In the debrief, he described the attack as inhumanly precise. What haunted him most was not the loss itself, but the realization that the Mustangs had been waiting exactly where his group would climb. They knew our altitude, our timing, everything, he said. We were the ones being intercepted. The Luftwaffe's intelligence branch soon confirmed Weber's suspicion. American bomber streams were now accompanied by advanced radar coordination and long-range direction, finding that guided escort groups from England and forward bases in Italy to intercept German fighters mid-climb. Combined with drop tanks, this meant the P-51s could remain in the fight for hours, moving from one engagement to the next like predators across an open plain. For a German pilot in 1944, survival no longer depended solely on skill. It depended on luck. By May, the attrition became visible at every airfield. The dispersal areas that once hummed with the noise of a dozen squadrons were now quiet. Mechanics worked on aircraft that would never fly again because replacement parts no longer arrived. The smell of high-octane fuel, once familiar, was replaced by the sharp tang of substitutes made from coal. At one base near Merseburg, a group of new pilots arrived fresh from training. Their instructor, an ace named Siegfried Lemke, gave them a speech that his men later described as half farewell, half confession. "You must understand," he told them, "our task is no longer to win the air war. Our task is to delay defeat long enough for others to make sense of it." He paused, then added quietly, "If you meet the Mustangs, do not try to fight them in the vertical. They own the climb now." That sentence, "they own the climb now," spread through Luftwaffe units like an admission of surrender. The change wasn't only tactical, it was psychological. For years, the Luftwaffe's elite had been raised on the legend of the individual, ace the pilot as warrior, mastering his machine through instinct and daring. But against the disciplined squadrons of the 8th Air Force, that mythology began to break. The Mustang pilots flew not as lone duelists, but as coordinated elements of a greater system. They fought within doctrine, rotation, and overwhelming logistics. To the Germans, it felt less like combat and more like inevitability, manifesting in metal and fuel. A captured German diary from June 1944 contained a haunting line written by a 21-year-old pilot. "When I see them high above, silver and calm, I feel not fear but exhaustion. They will come down soon, and someone among us will not come back. The difference is only who." He was killed 2 days, later near Braunschweig. By mid-year, Luftwaffe Command attempted desperate solutions. They deployed new interceptors like the Mi-262 jet and the heavily armed Fu-190D9. But even these technological leaps arrived too late and in too few numbers. The problem was no longer one of design, it was one of endurance. American airfields in England, Italy, and later France produced sortie rates the Germans couldn't dream of matching. Every destroyed Mustang was replaced within days. Every lost pilot had a trained successor ready to step in. For the Luftwaffe, each loss was a wound that didn't heal. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the Luftwaffe could muster barely 200 operational fighters against more than 1,000 Allied escorts. Those few who rose into the sky over the beaches often did so knowing they wouldn't return. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's famed fighter commander, later wrote, "When the P-51 appeared over Berlin and over Normandy at the same time, the war in the air was finished. It was no longer a contest between pilots. It was a contest between nations' ability to sustain flight." That realization tore through the ranks like a second front of despair. The Luftwaffe had begun the war as a symbol of invincibility, a force that crushed Poland, France, and half of Europe in a matter of months. By late 1944, it had become a defense line made of boys barely old enough to shave, flying machines older than they were. The men who had once dominated the skies over Britain now flew from camouflaged fields, hiding their aircraft beneath trees, waiting for orders that often never came. Above them, the Mustangs roamed freely, escorting bombers by day, hunting trains and airfields by afternoon. Their very presence reshaped the rhythm of life below. German civilians began to call the afternoon sky the time of silver death. One of the most chilling aspects of this period was how quickly the Luftwaffe's sense of control dissolved. In late July, over Thuringia, a group of Bf-109s from JG-3 engaged a small flight of P-51s. The fight lasted just 4 minutes. Of 12 German aircraft, 10 were lost. The surviving pilot, Unteroffizier Fritz Kallen, bailed out and landed in a wheat field. He was captured by farmers who pointed at the sky and said only, "They go everywhere now." Kallen later told interrogators that he hadn't seen a bomber during his entire last sortie. "The air," he said, "belonged entirely to the enemy." That simple phrase, "the air belongs to the enemy," would become the unspoken obituary of the Luftwaffe. By the autumn of 1944, the transformation was complete. The P-51's range was no longer merely a tactical advantage. It was a symbol of Allied inevitability. The Mustang had turned the geography of Europe against the Reich itself. No city, no base, no daylight hour was beyond reach. Berlin, once considered safe by distance, now lived under the constant growl of engines built an ocean away. In the final months of the war, Luftwaffe pilots still took off, still climbed into the pale morning light, but the purpose had changed. They no longer believed in victory. They flew for duty, for memory, for fragments of an old code that no longer protected them. And somewhere above them, calm, silver, and relentless, the Mustangs circled, guarding bombers that would level what remained of the Reich's heart. When the war finally ended, captured Luftwaffe officers would speak of many things, the shortages, the leadership, the mistakes, but again and again, one image recurred. The moment they first saw the Mustangs over Berlin, flying as if the distance from England meant nothing at all. To them, it was more than a technological surprise. It was the realization that the war's outcome had already been decided not by courage, but by reach. When the guns finally fell, silent in May 1945, Europe's skies were strangely empty. The contrails that had once braided across Germany were gone. What remained were fragments bent propellers half buried in fields, the faint smell of fuel soaked into hangar floors, and the silence that only comes after years of thunder. For the men who had flown there, the silence was deafening. Across occupied airfields, captured Luftwaffe pilots walked among wrecks that had once carried their pride. They studied the burned remains of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs as if seeing relics from another age. Some even paused before the twisted forms of downed Mustangs, acknowledging, in a quiet and almost reverent way, the machines that had outflown them. At the Allied interrogation centres, a question echoed again and again. When did you realise the war was lost? The answers varied in wording, but not in meaning. For bomber crews, it was the day the flak grew thin. For soldiers, it was when the front began to move west to east instead of east to west. But for the fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe, it was the morning they saw the P-51 over Berlin. In the months that followed, Allied engineers swarmed over captured bases. They catalogued everything from the Me-262 jets to the wrecked night fighters of the Wild So defense. Yet, what impressed them most was not what Germany had built, but what it had failed to counter. Reports from the U.S. Army Air Force's Tactical Evaluation Unit described the Mustang's impact in terms of strategy, not speed. It made geography irrelevant. The enemy can no longer define defense by distance. That single sentence captured the revolution in warfare that had unfolded silently above Europe. Range, the ability to project force beyond reach, had become the new measure of power. The P-51 proved that an aircraft was not just a weapon, but a bridge. It connected nations separated by oceans, factories separated by continents, and pilots separated by belief. After the war, many Mustangs were left parked in neat rows on European airstrips, their silver skins dull beneath foreign rain. Others were sold for a few $100s apiece to crop dusters, racers, and collectors who saw only speed where once there had been survival. Yet the legend endured. In post-war airshows, veterans would stand beneath the roar of those same engines, no longer weapons, but memories. Children would point upward, and the old men would look at each other in silence, hearing again the sound that had once meant both hope and death. For the Luftwaffe's survivors, the Mustang became an unspoken symbol of how modern war had changed. Their memoirs rarely spoke in bitterness. Instead, they wrote with a kind of admiration for the engineering, for the discipline, even for the enemy's courage. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most respected post-war air leaders, summarized it best. They had the range to follow their bombers and the range to find us again when we fled. The Mustang did not just defeat us, it erased the concept of sanctuary. Strategists studying the European air campaign drew two enduring lessons from the Mustang's reach. First, technological progress means nothing without the industrial capacity to sustain it. Germany built jets, rockets, and advanced engines, but never in the numbers required to matter. The United States built a fighter that was good enough, and then built enough of them to fill every horizon. Second, control of the air depends not only on machines, but on endurance of fuel, of pilots, of national will. By the time the P-51s appeared over Berlin, the Luftwaffe had already lost that endurance. The Mustang merely revealed it to the world. These lessons would shape the design of every future aircraft, from the swept-wing jets of Korea to the long-range bombers of the Cold War. In each, echoes of the P-51's philosophy remained: speed, reach, and the ability to protect those who carried the weight of destruction. Yet beyond the data and doctrine, the story remained human. In the decades after the war, Allied and German pilots occasionally met at reunions. They shook hands, exchanged photographs, and spoke of weather, altitude, and the strange fraternity of those who had once tried to kill each other. One such meeting took place in 1963 at an airfield in England. A former Mustang pilot and a former Luftwaffe ace walked side by side along the runway. When asked what he remembered most, the German smiled faintly and said, "How bright they were against the sun. We thought nothing could shine that far from home." In the end, the Mustang's victory was not in the number of enemies it destroyed, but in what it represented: the collapse of isolation. The same machine that erased Berlin's safety would later guard Berlin's freedom, flown by Allied pilots during the airlift of 1948. That irony was not lost on those who remembered. The airplane that once symbolized terror in German skies became, within a few years, a protector above them. As jet age dawned, the last Mustangs retired to museums and private hangars, but their story remained carved into aviation's collective memory, the moment when range became destiny. And somewhere in black and white film reels and fading logbooks, you can still find their echoes. The roar of engines crossing a continent, the silver arcs against a winter sky, and the quiet realization: on both sides, that the horizon had changed forever. The war had ended, but its echoes continued to travel. Across the ruined cities of Europe, where the sound of engines had once filled the skies, silence was not peace, it was aftermath. The smell of aviation fuel lingered long after the last sortie. In airfields like Wunstorf, Fassberg and Gatow, wreckage still lined the runways, half buried under the slow return. Rings of grass. Mechanics who had once worked through the night to keep machines aloft now swept hangars filled with ghosts. Among them were the men who had once sworn that Berlin was unreachable, that distance and geography would protect them. In the years that followed, those same men watched the new world rise on the wings of long-range flight, and they understood that their age had ended not with defeat, but with discovery. The Luftwaffe had entered the war believing that range was a fixed attribute, an arithmetic limit set by fuel, drag, and engine efficiency. Fighter aircraft were built as sprinters, not marathoners. The doctrine emphasized short bursts of speed and climb interception, not endurance. In 1939, this philosophy worked. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 could dominate a small sky the kind above France, Poland, or the Low Countries. But by 1943, the war's geography had outgrown the doctrine. The United States had turned industrial arithmetic into a form of strategy. It was not a question of whether a fighter could reach Berlin, it was a question of whether an economy could. American engineers had already learned to build systems, not machines. Every new component from the laminar flow wing of the P-51 and to the standardized drop tank was part of a logistical equation designed to extend not just flight, but influence. German engineers saw the numbers too late. At Rechlin, when they rolled the captured Mustang into the hangar and drained the last of its fuel, the mathematics spoke louder than propaganda. The realization was both technical and existential. If a single-engine aircraft could cross the entire Reich, then there was no hinterland left. Distance, once a shield, had become meaningless. To understand why the Mustang's range terrified the Luftwaffe, one must understand how the German Air Force thought of war. Its identity was built upon the myth of Kraft durch Technik, strength through technology. Every new design, from the Mi-262 jet to the W rocket, promised salvation through innovation. Yet the Mustang exposed the flaw in that faith. The real victory was not in invention, but in repetition, building thousands of good machines instead of a few perfect ones. While German factories struggled under bombing raids, American plants produced Mustangs by the hour. In Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, conveyor belts moved wings and engines like clockwork. The Luftwaffe's engineers had no equivalent rhythm. Their genius worked in isolation. Theirs was an art, not a system. When captured Mustang drop tanks were examined, their simplicity was shocking. Pressed paper, resin coating, and minimal metal fittings. They could be built in minutes, used once, and discarded. To German engineers accustomed to precision-machined aluminum, this was heresy, but to strategists, it was revelation. Victory came from what could be wasted. The Luftwaffe's pilots realized this truth with dread. They were not fighting another air force. They were fighting a factory. By the spring of 1944, the sky above the Reich had changed color. Contrails now appeared in patterns that reached farther east each week. Reports from radar stations described formations of bombers and fighters appearing simultaneously, an impossibility only months earlier. Luftwaffe interception groups scrambled and found themselves met not by brief encounters, but by escorts that remained, persistent as shadows. Pilots reported engaging Mustangs near Berlin and then again near Magdeburg or Hanover on their return flight. It seemed as though the same aircraft haunted the entire sky. The psychological effect was devastating. Veterans who had once relied on endurance mathematics, fuel gauge, range charts, plotted interception arcs, now found those tools meaningless. If the enemy could appear anywhere, the only defense was exhaustion. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe's attrition was no longer measured in aircraft lost, but in pilots broken. Each sortie became an act of endurance rather than strategy. When they landed, the young men climbed from their cockpits in silence, aware that every refueling meant facing the same endless horizon again. In the closing months of the war, a few German officers tried to confront the implications intellectually. At the Luftwaffe Academy in Berlin-Gatow, surviving instructors compiled studies titled Reichweite und Herrschaft, Range and Dominance. Their conclusion was simple and chilling: victory belongs to the power that can move the farthest and return. The idea seemed abstract, but it explained everything. It explained why the Allies could bomb ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt one week and oil refineries in Romania the next. It explained why the Mustang's appearance signaled not just air superiority, but inevitability. Distance was no longer geography, it was logistics, material, and will. The Luftwaffe had mastered none of them. In the ruins of the Third Reich, Allied investigators discovered hundreds of pages of notes from Rechlin's technical offices, precise fuel tests, engine efficiency graphs, aerodynamic comparisons. One file bore a handwritten title, Warum die Mustangs zurückkehren konnten. Why the Mustangs could return. Its first line read simply, because they carried America with them. That phrase would reappear decades later in the memoirs of test engineer Hans von Ohain, one of the pioneers of the jet engine. He reflected that while Germany had invented the future, America had industrialized it. The P-51 was proof that invention without production was a mirage. The captured Mustangs that had once been tested at Rechlin and flown under German markings were scrapped after the war, their remnants buried beneath new concrete runways built for jet aircraft. Yet in those same runways lay the blueprint for the modern world. 2. Air power measured not by speed or altitude, but by reach. The men who had flown the Mustang carried its legacy into peace. In Korea, its descendants, now in polished metal and bearing the same laminar wings, flew ground attack missions in a new kind of war. In the Cold War, its philosophy of long-range escort evolved into jet bombers and aerial refueling tankers that could cross oceans. Every time a P-52 took off with fighters guarding its wings, it was reenacting the logic first proven over Berlin. Every time a satellite drew its orbit across the map, it extended the same principle to the edge of space. The Luftwaffe's defeat had therefore been more than military, it was philosophical. The idea of defense through distance had died. The planet itself had become too small for isolation. Decades later, historians tried to measure what the Mustang had really achieved. Its combat record, over 4,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, was impressive, but insufficient to explain the depth of its legacy. What mattered was not the number of victories, but the kind of victory it represented. In Allied archives, reports from bomber crews reveal how morale shifted once Mustangs began escorting them to and from the target. Before, missions to central Germany were acts of fatalism. After the Mustang, they became operations. A sense of protection changed, behavior crews flew steadier, defensive fire grew coordinated, and survival became imaginable. In Luftwaffe records, the change was equally stark. Pilot debriefings from late 1944 describe encounters where the enemy did not seem to tire and where the same squadron insignia appeared over multiple sectors. The implication was haunting. One opponent had become many because one aircraft could be everywhere. By the 1960s, Germany had joined NATO. Former Luftwaffe officer trained alongside American pilots flying the F-104 starfighter, itself a distant descendant of the Mustang's philosophy: speed, climb, range. During joint exercises, veterans sometimes shared stories. The conversations were technical, never political. They spoke of compressibility at high altitude, of the feel of a control stick in turbulence, of how the Merlin engine's note differed from the Daimler-Benz. These were men who had once fought for opposing worlds, now united by aerodynamics. For them, reconciliation was not ideological, it was mechanical. In that shared language, the past became bearable. One German instructor at a NATO airbase in Norway was asked what it felt like to train under the very emblem that had once represented his enemy. He smiled and said quietly, "We learned that speed has no nation." The Mustang's silhouette, with its long nose and low canopy, came to symbolize not just victory, but transformation. It appeared on postage stamps, in films, and on the patches of squadrons that had never existed when it first flew. Its very name, Mustang, carried the mythology of freedom, wildness, and range. In this sense, the aircraft transcended its creators. It became a story about what technology can reveal about belief. The Luftwaffe's terror in the face of its range was not simply fear of defeat, it was fear of obsolescence. The world they had been trained to defend no longer existed. Their maps had become meaningless. Every era writes its truths in the sky. In the 1940s, the vapor trails over Europe wrote one such truth: that no empire can hide behind its borders once flight extends beyond imagination. The P-51 and Mustang did not end the war alone. It did something subtler and more permanent. It redefined what it meant to be safe. In doing so, it forced the 20th century to confront a new paradox, that progress would always shorten the distance between enemies. The same technology that carried destruction to Berlin would, within a few years, carry food and coal to the same city during the airlift. Thus, the legacy of the Mustang is not conquest, but connection. Its wings spanned the transition between isolation and interdependence. Its engine sung the first notes of the global age, and for the Luftwaffe pilots who once watched them appear from the western horizon, there was perhaps one final irony that what they feared most was not the machine itself, but the future it foretold. Even after the war, the shadow of those long-range Mustangs lingered over former Luftwaffe bases. Pilots who had once taken off in Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs would occasionally describe the experience as a confrontation with inevitability. The Mustang, in its simplicity, range, and durability, had revealed a truth that no doctrine, propaganda, or technical manual could conceal. Geography alone could not protect a nation from an opponent who had mastered production and logistics. German engineers and officers had spent years perfecting high-performance designs. They prized maneuverability, climb rate, and engine efficiency above all else. But the Mustang did not conform to this hierarchy. Its true strength lay not in maximum speed or dogfighting ability, but in endurance and industrial reproducibility. The P-51 in B and C models carried enough internal fuel, supplemented by drop tanks, to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back a feat. German intelligence had long considered impossible for single-engine fighters. When Luftwaffe test pilots flew captured Mustangs at Rechlin, the experience was almost disorienting. It was unlike anything we had flown before. One officer later recalled, the aircraft handled predictably, yet effortlessly. Its control surfaces responded without the twitchiness that German planes often exhibited at high altitude. In every turn, climb and dive, the Mustang seemed to defy the conventions that the Luftwaffe had trained its pilots to trust. In a war measured in fractions of seconds, such a difference was profound. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Reports from the summer of 1944 indicate that German pilots began to view long-range missions with fatalistic resignation. The presence of P-51 and Second over the Reich meant that every interception risked engagement with an enemy that could linger and fight far longer than expected. The very notion of a safe corridor for bombers vanished. Strategic calculations, which had once relied on predictable aircraft limitations, now required constant adjustment, and even then, they were insufficient. Beyond the cockpit, the Mustang became a symbol of America's industrial strategy. While German engineers debated design refinements and aerodynamic tweaks, American factories cranked out P-50 and Second with remarkable efficiency. Standardization, assembly line optimization, and interchangeable parts allowed the United States to maintain operational tempo across multiple theaters, whereas the Luftwaffe struggled to repair even a few damaged aircraft at remote airfields. The Americans had the capacity to deploy hundreds of fully operational fighters in rapid succession. The captured Mustangs revealed the implications of this at Rechlin. Technical excellence without industrial scale could not counter sheer quantity combined with functional competence. The broader strategic consequences of the Mustang's reach extended into the Allied bombing campaign. Prior to its arrival, daylight raids over Germany had been perilous. Bombers flying unescorted faced near certain attrition beyond the first 100 miles from their bases in England. The arrival of long-range P-51 escorts changed the calculus entirely. Now, bombing formations could reach the Ruhr, Berlin, and beyond, with significantly improved survival rates. Crew morale shifted too. Confidence replaced dread, allowing bomber pilots and navigators to focus on precision rather than survival. The Mustang had redefined not just tactical possibilities but operational psychology. For the Luftwaffe, the effect was cumulative. Each encounter with a Mustang left traces in reports, after-action notes, and personal recollections. Pilots noted the aircraft's ability to maintain formation, its fuel reserves, and its tolerance for prolonged combat. Engineers recorded the simplicity of its drop tanks and the effective distribution of weight across the airframe. Each detail contradicted prior assumptions and exposed the growing disparity between Allied production capability and German strategic planning. It was a lesson learned too late. The war's outcome hinged not on ingenuity alone, but on the ability to scale ingenuity into sustained action. In the months after Berlin was repeatedly overflown by P-51 escorted bombers, the Luftwaffe adapted, but only marginally. New defensive strategies, dispersal of aircraft, and hastily implemented radar coordination could not overcome the basic reality. The Mustang's endurance and industrial backing made interception an uphill battle. By the autumn of 1944, German reports reflected a stark acknowledgement. The sky itself had changed, and with it, the framework of air defense had shifted irrevocably. Post-war analyses reinforced this perspective. Historians and aviation specialists studying Luftwaffe archives, Rechlin test documents, and Allied mission logs observed a recurring theme. The Mustang was not the fastest fighter, nor the most heavily armed, nor the most maneuverable. Its decisive characteristic was that it could reach any target within range of England, fight, and return safely. The combination of sufficient fuel, reliable high-altitude performance, and mass production created an operational multiplier that no single Luftwaffe plane or pilot could counter effectively. The legacy of the Mustang extends beyond its war record. It demonstrated that technological and industrial decisions are inseparable from strategic outcomes. A fighter plane is not merely a machine, it is a node in a complex network of logistics, manufacturing, training, and doctrine. The Luftwaffe's underestimation of this network revealed a critical vulnerability. Superior design, when isolated from industrial sustainability, is insufficient against opponents who have mastered both engineering and production. Former Luftwaffe pilots, when reflecting decades later, often described the Mustang not in terms of statistics, but in terms of inevitability. To them, it was a revelation of what modern war required: coordination across disciplines, from factory floors to operational strategy. Flying a captured Mustang, they realized the mismatch between their training and the emerging realities of industrialized conflict. Some of these men would later contribute to NATO aviation programs, carrying the lessons learned into the jet age and training future pilots on the principles of endurance, systems integration, and operational range. The psychological shift catalyzed by the Mustang is equally notable. Where once confidence in superior skill, training, or individual aircraft performance had sufficed, pilots learned that victory depended on systems-level thinking. The ability to execute sustained operations, maintain logistical resilience, and exploit numerical advantage became as important as individual bravery or technical ingenuity. The Mustang, in this sense, was a mirror of modern warfare. It exposed both strengths and vulnerabilities, not through single dramatic engagements, but through persistent operational presence. Ultimately, the P-51 and Mustang's Escort range reaching Berlin and back was not simply an engineering triumph, it was a statement about industrial philosophy and strategic foresight. It highlighted the limits of belief systems grounded in outdated assumptions and revealed the consequences of underestimating an adversary's capacity for sustained action. The aircraft became both a tool of war and a teacher of history, a tangible reminder that in conflict, endurance often outweighs speed, and reproducibility often surpass perfection. By the end of the conflict, the legacy of those long-range Mustangs had been cemented. In training manuals, after-action reports, and oral histories, their role as agents of operational change is unmistakable. They demonstrated that technological innovation must be paired with production scale, that reach defines strategy, and that psychological impact on the enemy can be as decisive as physical destruction. In the skies above Berlin, those lessons were written in contrails, observed by terrified German pilots who had once believed their capital was beyond the enemy's grasp. The story of the Mustang does not conclude with the war's end. Its influence reverberated through aviation history, shaping doctrines, inspiring aircraft design, and redefining the parameters of air superiority. It reminds modern audiences that every aircraft, every engine, every drop tank is part of a larger system, one in which human perception, industrial capacity, and material reality intersect. For the Luftwaffe pilots who faced them, the Mustang was more than a fighter. It was an embodiment of inevitability, a quiet herald of the new age of war. And so, in the final accounting, the P-51 Mustang did what few weapons in history could. It changed not just the outcome of battles, but the understanding of what it means to wage them. By bridging distance and endurance, it taught a generation of soldiers, engineers, and strategists that true power lies not solely in the machine itself, but in the vision, coordination, and resources that bring it to life. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.